I've said it before and I'll say it again. Publish more non-spicy books.
Maybe hot take, but porn addiction counts when it's a book too.
Does anybody on this godforsaken app read a single book that isn't just straight up porn?
I'm gonna just come out and say it. We need to stop Booktok. We need to completely eradicate.
The women are reading corn everywhere.
It's not spice. It's not a romantic novel. It's porn.
Let's talk about it. If you, like myself, find yourself being chronically online, you've probably come across the current discourse regarding Booktok. Whether you're on TikTok or YouTube or even the platform formerly known as Twitter, I'm sure it's come across your feed at one point. The current discourse, of course, that rhymes, being that Booktok is nothing but pornography. I don't know what I can get away with when it comes to YouTube here, so going forward, we're going to refer to it as corn. First of all, why is this even happening? Well, to be honest, this conversation happens at least once a month. A new book will become incredibly popular, and people outside of Booktok, or even people just on the apps, will come across conversations about it. Usually, of course, those conversations are surrounding romance. Whether dark or not, that's really not the concern for these viewers. No, the concern here is that there is mass amounts of pornography happening. Now, when we say pornography, of course, we're referring to smutty books. These books that are apparently the entire purpose are for women. We're going to use mostly women here. But the discourse being that white, heterosexual, cis females are consuming pornography in mass amounts through literature. Now, this isn't inherently wrong, of course. There's tons of different genres of books that people consume. There's nothing inherently wrong with consuming sexual media. The discourse happening here seems to be more on the morality and, frankly, the desire to be better than when it comes to books and reading. And I say this as someone who actively consumes the genre of romance. I partake in dark romance sometimes, though there's a lot of specific caveats on what I consume or enjoy. Frankly, I don't find a lot of the stuff in that genre to be to my liking, but of course that's why there's different levels to it. What we're going to talk about today is the current discourse about Booktok and why we're having this conversation. Honestly, from my perspective, as someone who consumes a lot of content regarding books, literature, media as a whole, who follows a lot of creators, I am constantly exposed to this discourse. And frankly, I'm constantly exposed to those having this discourse on behalf of people consuming this. And when I say that, I mean people who don't consume the genre, don't have anything positive to say about the genre. These people aren't interested in actual discourse about what's going on in these books, about the genre as a whole, about its consumers. They're just interested in rage baiting.
Yeah, don't worry with me, you just won't.
And when I say that, I mean they're interested in getting views on a topic that people seemingly come together about every month and seem to come together on the same subject every month, which is, of course, pornography. When we talk about porn in these books, we're talking, of course, about scenes which include intercourse, scenes which include, well, just overtly sexual scenes. Let's be real. We're not going to kid ourselves here. It's people having intercourse. Again, I'm sorry. I don't want to sound like your high school sex education teacher. I just don't know what I can get away with saying when it comes to this. So forgive me as I find my footing here. When we talk about porn in these books, we're talking about the fact that there's a perception these books are nothing but pornography from page 1. Now, of course, there's going to be a book that you read in this genre that might start out with a scene that is just smutty. That might be how the book starts. You never know until you open it. But the conversation here is that the entire book consists of these things. And as someone who has, frankly, read a lot of them, I spent a lot of the end of last year reading a lot of them because I was new to the genre. I found myself consuming them. I found myself hyper consuming them. I got a Kindle for Christmas and my husband didn't see me for, 8 hours a day. I was reading a lot. Of course, not all romance. It's a Kindle library. You can add things. But I found myself reading a lot of them and a lot of varied genres within it. When you think about the romance genre, you're going to see lots of different subgenres. You're going to see fantasy. You're going to see things like romantasy, things like Sarah J. Maas. And while I'm not a fan of her, it's a huge market when it comes to romance in these groups. You've got thrillers. You've got an entire queer genre when it comes to romance. You've got horror romance. Just calm down, YouTube. I'm French Canadian. Give me a break here. So when we're talking about these books and what's in them, it's important to discuss what kind of genres there are, what kind of spice levels there are, what kind of stories they are. What is the author trying to tell you when you're reading this? And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of fluffy stuff out there. And when I say fluffy, I don't mean level of fluff, because that in itself is its own genre. Fluffy romance, it's so good. I love a good himbo. That is like my entire Kindle. I love a good himbo. Are you kidding me? A himbo and a grumpy sunshine narrative? Love it. Absolutely love it. I would just eat it up all the time. But when we're talking about these things, we're not including genre into the conversation. What we're talking about is just a desire to demonize these readers. And don't get me wrong, we're going to talk about it. We're going to get into why Booktok can be a little unhinged. But we're going to mostly focus on the fact that the narratives that come out of these discussions aren't problems. They're not actual issues. They're issues and dog whistles at times for right-wing media. And I know that's a lot to jump into here, but if you're watching this, you've likely experienced the discourse and you're looking for more conversation on the discourse of Booktok. But one of the big issues is when I see people talking about Booktok and I'm going to keep saying Booktok. I do also mean other platforms like YouTube, because there's a lot of good creators on YouTube, and it's a great way to consume reviews. It's a great way to, just consume content. I myself am a content creator. This is my first foray into commentary, realistically. But this subject has gotten on my nerves enough that I've decided, you know what, I'm going to sit down and we're going to talk about it. Talk about Booktok. Other than the vilification of its readers, of its creators, we seem to get stuck in the weeds when discussing issues. Mostly what I see a lot is people complaining that it's all they see. They're complaining about the fact that their algorithms are only showing them romance books or romantasy, and you're not going to like this, but that's your own fault, realistically. We're going to use TikTok in this conversation, but the TikTok algorithm is actually incredible, in my opinion. And you might, there's conversations to be had about it. The TikTok algorithm for your interests is honestly incredible. You watch a video, you like it or not, you watch a video long enough, you're going to see something similar. If you like that video, if you comment on that video, if you share that video, it makes no difference. If you stay and you watch a 4-minute video on a girl talking about her favorite romantasy book or her current hyperfixation regarding the genre, if you stay long enough, even just to, partake in watching her be cringy, the algorithm is going to just presume that you like content like that. If you comment on content like that, whether or not, you're saying you like it in your comments, or even if you're saying you hate it or you're arguing with the creator, TikTok is gonna think you like it. So a good portion of this discussion when it comes to these creators is on them. It's on them. I see time and time again, creators jump onto TikTok screaming about how they just want to see high fantasy, how they just want to see thrillers or biographies and not just the next TikTok romance book. And you know what? If you're not just immediately swiping once you hear, hey, look at this new romance book I like. Hey, this is an author known to be romance genre, or known to write romance genre. If you're not clicking away from it, it's on you. And I know that sounds so harsh. I understand. But at the end of the day, you have to put a little bit of blame on yourself for curating an algorithm that is so well curated that TikTok knows to keep showing you these things. I mean, I spent a month where my For You page was nothing but Asterion from Baldur's Gate 3, and that's as someone who didn't romance him. Hi, this is editing Tony here, and I would just like to state that, yes, I did end up romancing Asterion, and it definitely had to do with those TikToks. But if you think I haven't consumed enough Sleep Token thirst edits to Asterion to last a lifetime because I just sat there glued to it, you're wrong. I am not above this. But I am also knowledgeable how this works. And if you don't know how it works, then hopefully this is a great way for you to figure it out and make paths or make steps to move forward. There's a weird, I would say, morality issue when it comes to Booktok and its vilification of these women consuming content like this. One thing about these romance novels and whatever genre, we're not going to get too deep into this right now, but when it comes to these novels, it seems like a huge vilification of it comes from the fact that these books can be arousing. These books can be kinky. These books can, frankly, get women off. And I'm speaking in the sense of cis, white, hetero women. You know, not even just white, but cis women in general, because that seems to be the conversation happening. But it seems to be that there's a vilification of these women finding themselves in these books and finding things that they might like from these books. And the critique here is that just because it's written corn doesn't mean that it's not corn. The inherent problem with that take, okay, is that no one's saying it's not erotica. The conversation being had isn't that these women are consuming erotica. It's the conversation that these women are getting off or being allowed to get off and then adding it to their Goodreads goal. And it's somehow cheating. Like, oh, just because you read this book that got you off doesn't mean you're better at reading just because you consumed so much of it. You're not even reading Tolstoy. Have you ever heard of Kerouac? I bet you've never picked up anything that didn't start with a chord of something something. That's the problem here. There's a weird morality and a weird crossover of this in just being pretentious as hell. You've got mostly men, and I'm going to single out men in this conversation because there is also a subset of women who we'll refer to as pick-me's. I mean, realistically, it's just, please notice me. I'm not like these girls. I'm not like these women. I like Brandon Sanderson. I like Stephen King. And even though Stephen King writes horror and other genres, obviously the man has way too many books. I will never finish them all, and he's not that much my cup of tea. But even though Stephen King writes sexual scenes or incredibly disturbingly sexual scenes, I read it as a very formative age. I should not have read it at a formative age. Nobody should have read it at a formative age. Even though someone like Stephen King writes sexual scenes into his books, it's not vilified. If you got off on a sexual scene in a Stephen King novel, you're still reading literature. You're still consuming something good, something yummy, something good for your brain. This book has something to tell you. What did it have to tell me? What did it have to tell? It gave me a fear of clowns until Tim Curry. It gave me so much trauma when it comes to that sexual scene. If you've read it, you know. You know. I don't have to go into it, but you know. There's an inherent just morality when it comes to reading. And the morality is that these ladies don't really read. They're just getting off. And that's why we're reading, 400-page books. It's just to get off. Now, I'm not someone who consumes literature by people like Sarah J. Maas or Rebecca Yarros. I think that's how you pronounce her name. I don't consume their content, and I know that's very popular on Booktok. They're not my cup of tea. I have a lot of issues with them, We're not going to get into it though. If you want to get into it, there's a lot of creators on this app who have done videos, and if you want me to get into it, I can later. But for now, we're just going to talk about the fact that these women write gigantic books. Like, we're not going to kid ourselves. And if you think those books are written solely for the fact that it's to act as pornography, you're incredibly wrong. And honestly, you're just being misogynistic. Now, these women have written, well, I'll credit Sarah J. Maas on this a little bit more, but these women have created fantasy worlds. Now, you can sit there and talk about the fact that they're heavily influenced by other fantasy creators. I know there's a lot of conversation about Sarah J. Maas being incredibly influenced by Tolkien, but at the end of the day, they've still created these huge fantasy worlds. And the conversation being had is that we're reducing these series. And I think there's like 16 books in that A Court of Thorn and Roses series. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think there's like 16 books in that. And those books are not small. So if you're going to look at me and tell me that these women consuming this content, this amount of content, are purely doing it so that they can get off, you're just wrong. And it's okay to be wrong about it, but you're just wrong. Do you think I read Brandon Sanderson, okay? I just finished Rhythm of War at the end of the year last year. Do you think that I would sit through one of the worst books in the Cosmere series? Debate it. I don't care. It's the worst one. It was so much. If you think that I read over 1,000 pages of that book in what is now a 6-book series, if you're considering the side quests, if you think I'm putting that time and effort in because, let's say, there was spicy scenes in it, you've got another thing coming. I'm sorry. Nobody is consuming that much content when it comes to reading for the purpose of getting off. There is so much easier ways of consuming content to get you off than sitting down and reading a 400-page book. When I open my Kindle and I open one of these books and I look at the pages on it, I know Kindle is a much quicker way to consume books for some reason. I don't know. I think I'm just inherently an iPad kid. I'm 31, but I'm still an iPad kid. When I open one of these books and it's going to be 400 pages and I came here for an enemies to lovers, I'm ready to cry. That is so much. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm going to read it, obviously, if it's good enough. But it's still a lot. So to say women like Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros who have written books that are pretty hefty. I know Fourth Wing is pretty hefty itself. Again, I don't read it. They're hefty freaking books. To reduce the work that they've done into something as belittling as pornography just because the girl you like on TikTok who won't, answer your DMs is enjoying it and not talking to you and is picturing the really buff, really tall, because they're always the really buff and really tall guy with like long hair and maybe he's a fae. If that's what you need to do to feel better about yourself, okay, but keep it in your group chat or something. I don't know. Don't make a video about it condemning every single woman on the platform for consuming a romance book, okay? Just think about your life. Think about your choices. So, can we stop pretending that all romance books are created equal within its genre? When I say this, I mean the fact that not all romance books have anything to do with intimacy in a physical level. Some romance books, can be just about romance. You can read a cute little rom-com. You don't necessarily have to read something that includes spice. There's a lot of levels to romance. A lot of people aren't comfortable with dark romance. I kind of dabble, but I can definitely say I have my lines. My lines are those that have anything to do with or are around books like Haunting Adeline. That speaks for itself, and we won't get into that. But romance books as a genre have different varying degrees. I mean, it's why we have so many tropes when talking about these books. Unfortunately, because of those tropes, a lot of other books get reduced to tropes, I find, when talking about it. But when we're talking about romance books and, their place in society, you have a lot of people who just seem to want to complain about romance as a whole, as a genre itself. And again, to touch on people just being pretentious about it, they want to spew things like the classics, but don't consider things like Shakespeare, Jane Austen, to just name a few, as being some of the biggest proponents to the genre. A lot of books nowadays are just retellings of these. One of my favorites is Pride and Prejudice. Shout out to the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, where Matthew McFadden did the hand thing that we all think about weekly, or at least I just do. I think about it weekly when I wake up or when I'm laying in bed, and I think about the fact that it was improvised, and I think about that movie a lot, and I think about The Fog a lot. Anyways, I consume a lot of books that are retellings of Pride and Prejudice because I enjoy that dynamic. So if something's like a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, I will probably check it out. I think I've watched every film and television adaptation of it. My favorite is the Bollywood version, which is Pride and Prejudice, and it's very good. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend going watching it because it is a wonderful time. You will enjoy it. There's so much fun. There's so much music. It is fun. It's colorful. It's beautiful. Anyways, moving on. When we talk about the pretentiousness in regards to the romance genre, we discredit a lot of the greats, and we discredit a lot of the fact that classic literature was so romantic. I am also someone who consumes a lot of horror. But one thing that I really enjoy is gothic horror, because gothic horror is very romantic. There's probably a lot of good videos on here about the connection in that. But for me, I'm a huge gothic romance consumer. And I'll tell you what, there's hardly ever any smacks in it. It's usually slow burn with the relationship and mental health, but it's a genre within romance that does not inherently become sexual. And we've got things like dark romance. Again, I don't consume a lot of it anymore. I kind of dove into the deep end with dark romance and realized, I was going to have to get real cool with a lot of stuff if I was going to enjoy this. And I wasn't ready to get that cool with it, honestly. That's just a personal thing. No, I'm not going to shame you for what you like. What I will shame is when authors inherently do not put correct trigger warnings in their books. It's a big thing within dark romance that authors will put a trigger list and a content warning, which is, I think, a wonderful thing to do. But they will put trigger warnings and content warnings at the beginnings of these books so that you know what you're getting into, and you might not be comfortable with it. I know there's a lot of authors that will fake their trigger warnings a little bit, or maybe they're just a little bit cloudy on the content that they're creating. But I know people like H.D. Carlton do not like to put the correct trigger warnings in her books. And she has got flack for it. So I hope going forward she changes that. That's my issue with the genre. I'm not going to, I'm not going to yuck on someone's yum when it comes to it. I understand a lot of the kinks that come out with things like dark romance and how it is a little bit of a safer space to consume these kinks, which is a conversation about the sexuality of women here. Back to the vilification of women consuming these things. Books are a very good way for women to explore their sexuality without endangering themselves. And it's also a good way of exploring their sexuality in a way that feels comfortable to them, in a way that provides a place where they can come to terms with the fact that they might not be comfortable with things in day-to-day life, but they might like reading about them. I know there's a lot of stuff when it came to reading, erotica, that I can sit there and go, hey, that's great on page. I like that. I really like that. But I'm not going to test it out with my husband, because either I'm not flexible enough or it's just not something that interests me. But I will read about two hot people doing it to the end of time. Books create this safe space for women to consume kink and get more comfortable with kink and not have to feel pressured in situations regarding kink. A lot of times when women want to consume this content, the only platform is pornography, visual pornography, the Black and Yellow website that we're not going to talk about, or state, a hub of corn, if you will. Sometimes for women, the only option is to view it. Not all corn, but a majority of pornography is seen through the male gaze. And a lot of times, women who might be more comfortable with consuming a little bit rougher books, let's say, might go on to these websites to search similar interests. And frankly, a lot of these videos are very violent. They're not very consensual feeling sometimes, and that could be the kink that they're looking for. I know myself, I have seen videos in the past where it feels questionable and it doesn't feel like a production. It feels dangerous and not in a fun way. Now, someone might see these things and they might be completely opposite. But pornography as a whole is usually very violent. And just because it's not including something like choking or spanking or something like that. It can be very violent with the gaze that it's portraying. And when I say that, it's very male dominated. It's through a lens that is very get it done quick and get as much as you can in that amount of time. It can feel at times that the women in these videos are an afterthought, that this is inherently for men to receive a pleasurable time. And unless that falls under a kink for you, it's not a good experience a lot of the time. And it's one reason women in general don't like pornography. As opposed to reading books that provide a plot, that provide events, that provide enthusiastic consent. Consent about maybe trying out a new move between the two characters, consent between the situation that they're in, consent between two parties, the place they're at, consent all around. And that's a conversation within these books, is that these books can feel like a safe place to consume kink because parties, most of the time, are consenting and verbally consenting, enthusiastically consenting on page. When you can read something a little bit more spicy and a little bit more dark, and you have a character reminding the protagonist that they would like their consent, that they need to use their words, it amplifies that feeling that everyone here wants this to happen. It amplifies the fact that me as a reader, I get to see that these characters want to be in this situation and that they feel safe in this situation, whether or not the actual scene is safe. I know a lot of pornography is talked about beforehand, which is good, but that's a conversation for pornography. That's a video for pornography. Just as a whole, these books create a safe space for people to consume sexual acts and consume maybe like sexual kinks that they might have in a safe way that doesn't put them at risk of going on Tinder and looking for people who might be interested in doing these things and then having a horrible experience. So the dark romance genre, I know a lot of people who enjoy reading it, but who would never want to partake in it, who enjoy it, but would never want to partake in their daily life. And that's perfectly fine. It's a form of media in which they can, and it doesn't hurt anyone. And that's the conversation, is that it doesn't hurt anyone. So a lot of conversations that I do see surrounding the rants on Booktok, I found, is that they'll immediately talk about people leaving comments on romance books in which they're asking, hey, what's the spice level on this? Can you rate it in chili peppers for me? And I see a lot of people complaining about it, which, if you're only looking for, erotica within your books, that's a different conversation. But if someone on TikTok is reviewing a book that looks inherently erotic, whether it's the title or the cover of the book or the summary that the reviewer is giving, and someone asks you, hey, what's the spice level on this? They don't automatically need that spice level to be 5. I think one thing that people might not be aware of is where things like the spice level comes from. Now, I'm gonna out myself a little bit here. I have spent a majority of my time online within fandom. And when I say fandom, I mean being on LiveJournal, because I'm old and writing fan fictions and consuming fan fictions and fandom discussions on livejournal.com because I'm old. It's amusing because it actually derives from fan fiction. Spice levels derive from something called the citrus scale. Now, when you were writing fan fiction back in the day, an easy way to inform your readers on how explicit one of these fanfics was going to be was by rating it through the citrus scale, where you'd have lemon or lime as a rating, and these would factor in on how explicit the intimate scenes would be within fics. And this was a good way to, people filter out if they want citrusy fics or not. Now people are very, very, very privileged to have things like AO3. I don't know how or when spice came to be, but I know that when I go on something like Goodreads, I can see reviews that have a spice level, which, again, derives from fandom. And if we're going to talk about spice level and fandom, we should talk about an inherent problem with these online communities of Booktok and YouTube who, frankly, are consuming spaces very similar to fandom that they might not have consumed before having it in their face. So I was someone who was on things like tumblr.com a lot, so much, like every day, multiple hours a day. This is not surprising for people who know me and probably met me through tumblr.com. But it's fandom space. There was people who were not in fandom on Tumblr, but majority of its consumers were in fandom in some way or the other. I myself was in a lot of movies, television, books, fandom, but on top of it, I was part of the wrestling community, the Tumblr wrestling community, for a good amount of time. So there's varying degrees of fandom when it comes to these spaces. And I think people who are seeing things like Booktok are probably experiencing online cringe for the first time. A lot of these can be inherently cringy. I mean, I can open up TikTok and I can see a book recommendation where someone only speaks in tropes, which is hilarious because I have spoken in tropes quite a bit in this. I understand the hypocrisy in this, but I've seen a lot of people just discuss books as tropes, and I myself find that cringy. If you can't tell me the summary of the book or what the book is about, but you can only tell me about the tropes, I don't know anything about the book you've just told me. But that's a different conversation. It's fine. But I find that cringy, and I get the ick from it. But I think what a lot of people are experiencing for the first time in this conversation is that they're experiencing social cringe, online social cringe for the first time. Do you know how many 14-year-olds were writing on Wattpad in the early 2010s and, creating One Direction fan fiction, and we all just let them? And it's okay because it's people just having fun in their lane and they're just being cringy about it. What's cringy to you is not cringy to everyone. But it's social cringe. It's online social cringe, and you're experiencing it for the first time because you've never experienced fandom. You've never been in these spaces where this is the norm. I notice a lot right now the conversation of fandom has gotten mean. I've seen a lot of takes about this. And the reason I'm correlating this with Booktok is because the people who are consuming fandom now may have consumed it during the schmandemic. I know that's a touchy word on here, and I don't want YouTube to get mad, but they consumed a lot of content during the schmandemic, during lockdown, and they looked for other people who might be interested in this. They consumed content about it. But these people who may not have consumed these types of media before have now entered spaces that have been long held by fandom, and they're trying to police it. They're trying to police how to act within these spaces when they weren't part of creating the spaces. When I say this, I mean there is a lot of discourse I see when it comes to fandom things. When it comes to popular ships, I'll open up the platform formerly known as Twitter, and I'll see these discourses about characters and ships that, honey, we've already had these conversations. You're bringing them back. We all settled on this topic before, whether good or bad. But now you're vilifying the community that you didn't help create, that you're just consuming for the first time. And the way this ties into Booktok is that these spaces have existed on different platforms before. Platforms like LiveJournal, platforms like fanfiction.net, AO3, Tumblr, YouTube, and the app formerly known as Twitter. TikTok is a very new part of this conversation. It is a new kid on the block, and it has helped. It has helped immensely with giving people access to these conversations. It's given people access to these fandoms, these spaces, which they might not have consumed before because they were never part of them. So it opens it up to a wider audience, and it opens it up to a wider judgmental audience who aren't used to how things operate. I'm sorry, but have you seen any fandom regarding any anime ever and thought, wow, this is a normal space? This is a totally normal space. We are totally normal men.
We're just normal men.
What do you mean, normal men?
We're just innocent men.
No, you haven't. You've never seen that. If you're going to sit there as an outsider who doesn't consume content like romance novels, you don't have a right to, call someone out for being cringy or call someone out for the things that they like in books. That's not your right if you're not consuming, if you're not part of a community. If you talk about books on Booktok, you likely have a set genre that you like. I follow a lot of fantasy, high fantasy or epic fantasy creators who are immensely helpful in me finding new stuff because I can't just read Robert Jordan for the rest of my life. Lord knows there's enough books. There's enough books that I could. There's a lot of creators who stick to their genres and don't demonize other people in other genres. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that if you're not going to dip your toes, if you've got nothing to bring to the table other than negativity when it comes to the genre of romance, you do not have a right to critique it. If you do not consume it, if you don't have any knowledge of it, you don't have a right to critique how people consume or enjoy the content itself, because you have nothing to bring to the table with this conversation. Now, if you're someone who regularly consumes this content, regularly consumes the genre, with any genre, it's not just romance. If you're someone who's regularly consuming this and you have actual discourse and actual critiques to bring to the table and have a conversation about, then that's different. Go ahead, engage. But if you're just some guy who read On the Road once in college and decided that it was going to be your big break on TikTok to yell about women and the things that they enjoy, fuck off. I'm being so serious right now. Fuck off. We don't need it. To quote Chappell Roan, what do these indie boys have to say? That is so important. You're not part of the community. And to pretend that you can police a community you're not a part of, to pretend that you can police a community that you may just have joined because you don't understand any guidelines or what's socially acceptable, just don't. Just walk away. Or if we're going to use TikTok terms, swipe up. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that Booktok does have real issues. Booktok itself does have actual things that need to be critiqued. Specifically, we're going to talk about the romance genre and its consumers, because there are actual conversations to be had about this. Not just interests or what women are consuming. We're going to actually discuss real issues with Booktok. A huge issue with Booktok that I come across as someone who is actively using it to find books is that the algorithm, while very good with interests, the amount of times I will open the app and go to my For You page, and not my following, but my For You page, and see a book recommendation by a creator who is white, usually a white female, is significantly more than I will ever see creators of color. I have a hard time with the fact that Booktok suppresses BIPOC voices. It's very prevalent. It's talked about a lot. It's why in the past, TikTok itself has been critiqued in different like subsections, have you will, spaces within itself, where there have been, you know, days of following Black creators, showcasing Black creators, because the app isn't. One thing I've seen time and time again is, you know, call to action for white creators to push people of color if they see them, to, you know, showcase them, showcase the people that they follow. to give these content creators help, essentially, because they're being completely ignored by the algorithm. And not even ignored's not the right word. It's being actively suppressed. It is a known issue. It's been called out multiple times in different communities of TikTok. But it's a huge issue in the Booktok community. I myself am mixed race. I know that I am incredibly pale. I know. I see it. But I myself am mixed race. I am indigenous and my mama's white. So, but I have to go out of my way to consistently search for indigenous creators and Black creators and creators of color. And on top of that, I'm also a queer woman. So not only am I just looking to see creators of color and Black creators, BIPOC creators, if you will, I'm also looking for queer creators or people who showcase queer content, because, you know, a big portion of romance books for me isn't just heterosexual. I don't want to just consume heterosexual content. This is a huge issue on TikTok, I find, where if we're going to complain about the fact that Booktoks have such a, like Booktok views and stuff have such a impact on things like your local bookstore and the shelves at your local bookstore. And this week in Booktok on shelves in your local bookstores, but a huge number of those books are going to be heterosexual. And it's not to say they're bad by any means. They could be great books, but at the end of the day, there's still heterosexual couples on these books. And the fact is, when looking for romance, a lot of the times romance books get funneled into the queer section of a bookstore or a website, which means they're not being displayed, which means that the social norm is usually white heterosexual when it comes to book recommendations. And it's quite a lot of times when I'm scrolling through my For You page that I only see these recommendations. That's an issue. That is truly an issue, because if we are only showcasing white heterosexual couples in the genre, that's a fault. These books exist. There's an entire Black romance genre. And the fact is that they're not being shown because TikTok suppresses a lot of these creators who would recommend these books maybe. So, you know, a call for Booktok creators who might be white, who might be heterosexual. Pick up a book. Pick up a sapphic book. You're tired of men in these books? You're tired of like complaining about the men in these books? Pick up a sapphic book. It's not going to turn you gay. I promise. It is going to show you that there are different options out there, though. But at the end of the day, it's a suppression issue on the app and on forms of YouTube, where you have to actively go and search for these creators, for this content. You have to type in Black Booktok to receive creators like this. And that's an issue. That's an issue that needs to be talked about more. It's an issue that needs addressing, and it's an actual active issue with Booktok that has real life consequences. You know, when you're not shown that there are different options, you think there's only one. There's a lot of young people consuming these TikTok recommendations, and they might be questioning themselves. or they might not have had this conversation with themselves yet. And an exposure to one book might be the key to helping them feel safe within themselves, helping them find and navigate their sexuality, or helping them find representation for their race, representation for their sexual orientation, or for their gender. And the fact that TikTok suppresses these voices and keeps those options away from youth and away from just general people from being able to discover these conversations, to be able to discover this content. And this is an inherent issue with Booktok. This is a real Booktok issue. The people having the conversation are the people affected. So when I say we're not talking about it enough, people with giant followings, people who don't fall into the line of being queer or being of a different race than white, aren't talking about this or using their platforms to talk about this. If you yell about it enough with the amount of followers that you have, I know there's huge Booktok girlies on this app who, if they talk about it, chances are it'll get addressed. It'll likely get addressed if they care enough to. It's caring about people of color, it's caring about queer people, but it's also caring about the authors that they're uplifting. I know I talked briefly about the fact that I don't consume Sarah J. Maas or Rebecca Yarros, or H.D. Carlton. I don't consume these authors from my own moral standings, and you can have different moral standings than me, but I don't consume them because problematic with things that they've said in the past, with things that they've written in the past, with views they might have that do not align with me. But these women hold a singular grasp on things like Booktok, mainly the romance genre, obviously. So the conversation of uplifting certain authors and exposing them and letting them get huge, famous, let's be real, is an issue that I find, because there's so many authors that I have discovered from Booktok who are on Booktok or YouTube who have written amazing works. There is a series that is considered dark, I will say that, so know that going into it. It's called The Halloween Boys, and it's a series. I'll put the author here because top of my head, I'm generally bad with names unless I hate them, clearly. But I will put the author here when editing. The books have queer, curvy representation. The female character of it is a plus size girl, and honestly, she's a mess. She's an absolute mess, and not in a quirky way. This girl is a mess. But the book, or the series itself, is very good. I do think it suffers from the fact that it's kind of badly marketed. But this could just be to the fact that the author likely has to do it all herself. The book series is very good. If you want vampires, if you want werewolves, if you want the damn devil, read that series. I'm telling you right now, it's so good. I found it on Kindle Unlimited, and the covers put me off because they just kind of looked like generic biker guys that had a mask stamped over their faces. So I think the author could do with like maybe a rebranding of those covers, especially on Kindle Unlimited, because I don't know if the physical copies are the same or not. But I remember sitting there going, oh no, this looks cheesy, but we're gonna give her a go. And honestly, it's one of the best series I've ever read. And this is just a woman on TikTok. Like, I discovered her through TikTok and I read her books. And it was great because it was a book about, you know, I'm not gonna lie, there was some monster loving in that. When you, like, you know, more on the humanoid end of things. But like vampires and werewolves, not in werewolf form. But I liked it a lot because it was a plus size female character, which is at times very underrepresented in the community, in the genre itself. And when it is, sometimes they're just inherently bad books. I'm not gonna lie. It can be a struggle to find good books that don't feel like they were written by a 50-year-old boomer mother who sexualizes every cashier at your local grocery store. But it's something I have to navigate. It's something I, as a, you know, queer mixed race woman who is fat, I have to navigate, and I have to look for these books, and I have to go through the trenches to find good ones. But I found it thanks to Booktok and coming across your screen. Another issue I find in discussion of the suppression of these voices is that because of it, we don't have good recommendations of the genre. We don't have books that center these voices that might have different things to say, and are just inherently good. I read The Roommate Risk a couple months ago now. I didn't like it. It wasn't my thing. No reason the author, like, no critique of the author on it. It wasn't my thing. And I can confidently sit there and say, I just don't like it. I have a hard time reading a lot of modern romance. I like historical, personally. If the Pride and Prejudice thing didn't give you that impression already, but it wasn't for me. But it's by a Black author, and it centers a Black woman, and I'm going to categorize him as Desi. I believe he was Desi. But anyways, these are voices and characters by actual people of color who aren't tokenizing these voices. A big issue I find in book recommendations a lot of the time is that, oh, look, the male character is a man of color, or he's ethnically ambiguous. So it's not just white people, except for the author doesn't know a single thing about what it's like to be a man of color, nor do they use something like a sensitivity reader, or likely have any friends who can sit there and say, hey, that's a little weird. Why are you fetishizing this man? And why do you think giving him tan skin makes him a man of color? He could be Greek. He could be a Greek man, or an Italian man, or a French man. My grandfather was French, and his skin color was leather. He was still white. Okay, so another issue I find with Booktok is that there is a huge issue with consumerism. There is a constant need to buy the book, and the book has to be right then and there. It's got to be the hardcover or the special edition, or you're missing out. You have FOMO because you don't have the book the day it comes out. Which, I mean, let's put some, actual caveats here and state the fact that, like, of course people want the book when it comes out. But what we're not seeing is people necessarily eager for the book to come out so much as they are eager to own the book. There is, a good portion of online content that is just special edition hauls, or look at my perfectly curated bookcase. Aren't they pretty? Aren't they color-coded? Do you see the spine? The sprayed edges? It's better than yours, and you should want it too. Why don't you have it? Did you know it's limited edition? Did you know you can no longer get it? I'm looking at you, Bridgerton series with Illumicrate. I don't know, I get it. But there's this inherent need to have the best version. There's an inherent need to own the latest special edition. You shouldn't need to put people financially in debt to consume your books. I just picked up The Familiar the other day. I've been waiting for this to come out. I am, at my heart, a vampire girly. This, of course, was before Lay was incredibly weird about talking about Palestinian people. Let's just say that. So that's unfortunate. But again, it's a conversation regarding uplifting authors or holding them accountable for genocidal views. If you're going to use the stories of people and profit off of talking about genocides within your books, but then not actively support people going through them, that's a hot take. We'll leave that as that. But I picked up the book. I was very excited for it to come. It cost me $40 because I'm Canadian. It's a hardcover. It's absolutely gorgeous. The inside is stunning. But it was $40. The price of books where I live is ridiculous. And there's not really a way of bypassing it. With the closure of certain online stores, like the Book Depository, there's others off the top of my head, I can't remember them. But anyways, they're closed, or they stopped selling to different countries because how expensive it was. With the closure of these spaces and resources, it's very expensive to purchase books. And I know this is not just a Canadian thing. There's been an uptick in American prices as well. And of course, internationally. Expensive in this economy. And to pretend it's not, and then constantly ask your readers to shell out more money for special editions of your books, it's a little shitty. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little shitty. Here's a third edition of the same book. I say this as someone who actively, through her teens and early 20s, went around collecting different copies of The Hobbit, and then realized that a paperback is a paperback. I don't have the money to afford the beautiful, rare copies of The Hobbit, so I should probably spend my money on new books instead. If you're financially stable enough to purchase multiple special editions each month of a book you already own, maybe like 3 times over, do it. If it makes you happy, do it. The issue here is that TikTok as a whole constantly pushes consumerism, let's be real, whether it's books or random Amazon finds, Stanley cups, the Utah mommy cup, not the hockey cup for other Canadians or hockey fans. TikTok tends to push a consumerative narrative a lot, so it's not surprising that Booktok should be any different, realistically. What is surprising is that there's not really conversations that I'm seeing that could be being had. I'm just not seeing them regarding consumerism in TikTok or consumerism in Booktok. There's not conversations about using your local library to get books, or maybe using something like Kindle Unlimited, which I know Amazon is a hellscape, and no one is safe under capitalism. There's no morality under capitalism, and we can only do our best. I myself subscribe to Kindle Unlimited. It costs Amazon more money to give me the amount of books I read a month on Kindle Unlimited than what it's worth. For me, I pay $9.99 a month for unlimited books. Obviously, it's limited to what's on the platform, but there's a great deal on the platform, and it financially saves me a lot of money. I since January have consumed 65 books, not all on Kindle Unlimited, but I've read 65 books this year, and a big help of that has been Kindle Unlimited, because I don't make enough money to read 65 books a year, or 65 books in 4 months. We're not going to talk about that amount of books. I have a lot of depression, and I'm currently unemployed, so we're not going to go into that. But the ability to read so many books for such a low price is incredible. People consume audiobooks for a similar price. Now, I wouldn't consider Audible good or cost effective, really. Their credit system is a little bit when it comes to things. I would say something like Everend, which used to be Scribbd. I would say Everend is a good resource for audiobooks and ebooks. They do ebooks too. They do music, magazines. It's a really good subscription. And it's a great way for me to consume audiobooks. So what's a plus? It's a pretty affordable, it's pretty market rate for a subscription. Like, for me as a Canadian, I think I pay $11.99 for it. But it's a great resource for consuming a lot of books. Now they're a little bit more limited, I would say, than something like Audible is. But that's not to say there's not a crap ton of books on there. Another great resource is Libby. Libby partners with libraries in your province or state, counties, however America goes, I don't know that Libby is outside of North America. I'm not 100% sure on this, but Libby is a great resource to free books. You sign up, use your library card. If you don't have a library card, most libraries in your area can be signed up through online. And you can use the resources there. We won't get into everything your local library can do for you, because that is incredible. The amount of resources your local library can do for you. If you're unsure, look up your local library. But it's a really easy way to help, navigate the constant consumerism of things like Booktok, getting the next whether you like it or not, getting the next Colleen Hoover book, you can get it for free through your local library. If it's not at yours, if you're using Libby, if it's not at your local library, chances are it's in one in your province or state, or they'll order it for you. That's a very free and easy thing. You might have to wait. I'm not going to pretend like it's instantaneous, because likely someone has been also waiting for that book. And, you know, you gotta wait, you gotta share. But it's free. Everend, most of the time, I will say, Everend doesn't have a lot of brand new stuff. You usually gotta wait about 3 to 6 months for the shiny new book to hit their shelves. Kindle Unlimited is very similar, unless the author has created, you know, a deal with Amazon on that to put their book on Kindle Unlimited. So you're kind of at their mercy for that. But if you want to buy the book, obviously. But there's this constant FOMO when it comes to Booktok, and I see a huge issue of it as someone who lives in a place where the cost of books are incredibly expensive. When the hell did paperbacks become almost $30? That was the price of a hardcover. What happened here? It's in our country. Like we have these publishers in our country. What is happening here? These warehouses are in Ontario, for Pete's sake. So it's very expensive to buy books. So the constant consumerism of TikTok and the fear of missing out on the latest book or the latest special edition is very prevalent on the platform. But that's a conversation as a whole. Like I said, consumerism is rampant on TikTok. You don't need 30 different accessories for your Stanley Cup. You don't need 30 different accessories for your Kindle. They're nice to have. If you can afford them, that's great. But you don't have to tell me I need this thing. I don't need it unless I actually need it. Like those, the Kindle bed arm thing that you can hook up to your nightstand or your bed so you can read your Kindle in bed with a little button. I don't need that. I want it. I desperately want it because that would be so nice. But I don't need it. Doesn't mean it's not valuable to people with disabilities who maybe would love it for their day-to-day so that they don't have to deal with mobility issues. But I don't need it. I want it. Again, I want it. I do not need it though. And it's just something that is consistently marketed towards me. And again, I know I watch the videos, so that's why it keeps coming up. But this conversation of you need this book. It's not usually the book. I'm not going to blame the book here, but I am going to blame the special editions. You have to get this because if you don't, it doesn't look aesthetically pleasing on your bookshelf without it. Your bookshelf doesn't have to look aesthetically pleasing. I say this is a Libra. My entire bookshelf is a hellhole. It's categorized properly, but it is a hole of aesthetic. But you don't need, like, I'm not trying to de-influence, honestly. I'm not the person to sit there because I will constantly go to the bookstore and look at my friend and say, yeah, you need that book. Buy it, girlfriend. Do it. You really want this. Go ahead. I am not the person to de-influence you. I am, however, going to critique the mass consumerism on Booktok. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I've left these two topics last in this discussion on the real issues with Booktok because they're a little bit more adult. When I talk about actual issues with TikTok, or with Booktok as a whole. And I talk about sexuality, and I talk about a safe space for kink and women to consume this content, and obviously others, like I said, but we're talking from a lens of white cis female. Booktok has a very bad issue with looping in underage consumers. The discussion that is consistently, seemingly spoken about is young consumers reading these books, these smutty books, these pornography books. Now, I won't say that there is any use in censorship, because I do not believe in censorship. But the fact is, every teenager at one point will read above their grade level. They're going to read above their comfort level. They're going to discover who they are as a reader and what they want. And it was the same for me. It was the same for my friends. It was the same for everybody, realistically. If you are an avid reader, there's more than likely a time where you read something and you realized how adult it was, whether or not that made you feel, you know, a little edgy or shocked or uncomfortable. There was a time you read something that you weren't ready for. And whether you'd like to admit that or not, that's fine. I can admit to the fact that when I was 14, I want to say, I discovered a book on my mom's shelf called Second Sight by Amanda Quick. And it was my first time reading anything erotic. Now, if you've read this book, and if you're a friend of mine, I have recommended you this book because it's very good and I recommend it to everyone. It's very well written. It's a fun adventure. It's a little paranormal. There's a lot of feminist storytelling, I would say. It's also a historical fiction. And I recommend this book like crazy. So I picked this off my mom's bookshelf when I was like 14. And like I said, it was the first time I'd ever read written erotica. Now, I mean, I'm a neglected child of the 90s. I was left alone in front of the TV in a family of action movie, horror movie fanatics. I've seen my fair share of schmecks on the television. I know what it is. However, I didn't know it could be nice. I didn't know it could be good for a woman. I didn't know it could be romantic or soft. And I read this book at 14 when I was also reading Twilight. Vastly different levels of conversation when it came to intimacy. I mean, like, when it comes to Twilight, we don't really talk about schmecks until Eclipse. And the discussion is very chaste. And the discussion is very... I mean, the book was written by a Mormon. We can talk about Twilight all day. Ask me about Twilight. I know so much. I love Twilight in a way that I hate everything about it, but I know so much and I love it so much. It's so much fun. So we have very differing levels of age-appropriate content when it comes to schmecks. And when I say age-appropriate, I mean settings. So in Second Sight, the two protagonists have a one-night stand. It is very hot and steamy, and then they go their separate ways, and then they're brought back through a series of events. It's all fun, everything like that. We get another couple more spicy scenes. By the end of it, they end up married, in love, and it finishes with another schmeissesehen. But to me, as a teen who spent far too much time reading Warrior Cats, and Lord of the Rings, and not really consuming any content that had to do with sex, schmecks. We'll see if YouTube let's make it away with that one. For a teen who wasn't exposed to that outside of the lens of TV and movies, where the lens of that in the 90s was very male-centric, male gaze, and just because you put a romantic song behind it doesn't mean it is nice. All this to say, I mean, like I said, I grew up on a lot of action movies and a lot of horror movies. So, not great examples of schmecks on screen there. But all this to say is that they were two very different levels of reading. And after that, well, I started reading a little bit more out of my comfort zone. I stopped reading strictly YA, and I started picking up a lot of older books, things like Dracula, because I don't think it takes a lot to look at me and know that I'm a baby goth. So a lot of the content I consumed book-wise was very gothic and very vampire, and there's a there's an inherent schmexualness of vampires. So the content that comes with it is a lot more than one would say age appropriate for 14-year-olds, realistically. And that's not to say people shouldn't consume, more adult fiction and works, but there is a discussion to be had on what is appropriate to push on children. I see a lot of people in comment sections of young girls and boys asking for book recommendations of romance, immediately putting things like Haunting Adeline or The Ritual. And of course, there's nothing inherently wrong about enjoying those books, but those books are made for adults. And when we talk about adults, we talk about adult themes and the comfort and knowledge of knowing what you're okay with as a person. The comfort and knowledge knowing that your brain is fully developed. That's just a fact. And the influence works can have on you. I know from experience that reading very hypersexual vampire stuff led me to seek hypersexual situations clubs where schmex is the, ultimate goal, and wasn't something I was actively wanting. Now, that's my own experience. It's obviously varied, but I'm a 31-year-old woman. My brain is fully developed. And while I might have my own triggers and content warnings that I need to be aware of and, go into things with my own need to make sure I'm comfortable and safe consuming the content, a 15-year-old girl does not. A 15-year-old girl does not have the knowledge and life experience. And I'm not saying that you have to have something happen to you to know that something's a trigger for you, because that's not how a trigger works. That's not how being comfortable works. But a 15-year-old girl doesn't understand that the implications of these male characters being violent, being incredibly abusive, having no sense of consent towards female characters in this. A 15-year-old is not going to understand that her worth isn't tied to that, and that that's not what she needs to be looking for in men. Because it's one thing to read about men like this. It's one thing to sit there and go, I'm kicking my feet because for some reason I find this very hot. I am so enamored with this stalker romance. However, if a man spoke to me like that in real life, I would run and call the police, and I wouldn't find it attractive. When we have these conversations about adult spaces, it's for a reason. It's to ensure the safety of minors. And when we are pushing books onto minors that include incredibly adult themes, it's irresponsible and it's fucking weird. You should not, as a 40-year-old woman being really attracted to bikers, tell a 15-year-old girl that she needs to read this because this is the type of man she should want. No, that's unsafe. You know it's unsafe. You're not Gemma Teller from Sons of Anarchy. You're just Donna from Kentucky. Okay? Go get your rocks off. But you do not need to influence a 15-year-old that this is what she should be looking for in men.
Hi, this is Editing Tony again. And I just want to state that when I say adult themes in regards to teenagers, I don't mean books that are created for teenagers and minors with adult themes that may help them in situations that they might be experiencing on their own. I mean books written specifically for the adult lens, not something age appropriate or discussing topics that might be affecting minors, youths, teenagers, all of that in their day-to-day lives and lived experiences. I just wanted to put that in there because I feel like I left that out and it needs to be stated before moms of liberty come into my comments and think it's a safe space for them.
She can find it attractive. She can go through that whole bad life experience herself. But if you're pushing it on her, it's fucking weird. It's incredibly weird to see women in the comments of young girls and young boys in their comment section recommending these very adult books. Whether or not they read them is between them, but it's not for you to recommend it. I also see a lot of the times that creators who might specialize in reviewing this type of content, not enforcing the fact that their page is for adults. Even just putting an 18 plus in the bio. If you're not actively enforcing that the content you're showcasing is adult, showcasing very adult themes that aren't just necessarily sexual. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not all inherently sexual. It's not about a kink or a way they're doing it in the book. It's themes of violence. It's themes of abuse, maybe drug abuse, alcoholism, substance abuse as a whole. A lot of self-harm is a common theme in these books. It's, as a whole, you shouldn't be recommending. These are adult books. The authors themselves state that these are adult books. So if you're recommending it to a kid, it's weird. Stop it. Stop it. Another conversation that is a little bit more is women on TikTok actively finding underage men, again, underage boys, and sexualizing them, being in their comment section, being incredibly lewd and making comments that, I'm sorry, if someone heard you in high school talking to a teenager like that, they would call the police. Just because it's behind a screen doesn't make it any less pedophilic. Oh, can I say that? Schmedophilic. Either way. There are women who will find young boys through things like videos of them showing off their new bike and immediately running to the comments and calling them Zayd or Daddy or you need to read this. A common one is Booktok is here. Have you seen this, Booktok? Wait till Booktok gets a hold of you. These are children. These are underage boys. And if the roles were reversed and men were doing this to young girls, which they do, let's not kid ourselves, might not be consistently about books. It's very prevalent in video games. If it was men going to the comment sections of teenage girls and leaving these styles of comments, there would be a parade of backlash towards them. So the parade of backlash needs to happen to women too. Don't get me wrong. I see multiple creators call this shit out. It's not a socially accepted thing, but it is a prevalent thing. I've seen it happen multiple times now. I have seen the comment sections of young boys getting into reading who, one famously, I say famously because people have talked about it before, a young boy who owned a motorcycle was showing off the books that he liked, and the books that he liked were the Hunger Games. He was showing off all 3 books in the Hunger Games series, and he was looking for recommendations of books he might like. Tell me why the comment section was filled with Haunting Adeline, with The Ritual. And I know I keep using these books, but they are very problematic books, and they are the ones that are most quoted when going into the comment section. So tell me why these women feel comfortable putting boys in danger like that. And I know it can sound dramatic about adult themes, but these boys do not have the knowledge that we do as adults to sit there and say, hey, I have media literacy. I know that this is a character in a book and that maybe that character is not the thing girls want. This is not how I should behave sexually or my day-to-day. I shouldn't treat women like this. They don't have the ability to make those decisions, those conclusions. When you have 30 different grown-ass women in the comment section telling them otherwise. To quote the idol himself, Stanley Hudson, "That boy is a child. Have you lost your damn mind? 'Cause I'll help you find it." It's absolutely ridiculous to expose young men, young boys, I keep saying men because there's an inherent bias to refer to them as such, as older than they are. They're children. They are under the age of 18. They should not be exposed to this. But we are exposing young boys and young girls to incredibly bad relationship dynamics when we're showcasing these to them. I don't mean to infantilize any young adults, any young readers by any means when I say this. But as an adult, I have the ability to sit back and make conscious decisions in what I read and know that at the end of the day, it's fiction, and that these are not relationships I should idolize because they're not healthy. I don't mean to infantilize you if you're watching. That's not the point of this. The point is your safety. You can read above your grade level. Hell, there are many classics I read in school that so many people would deem irresponsible to show children. You want to talk about classics? I read On the Road as a tween. I was 12, 13, but our English teacher made us read On the Road. That is an incredibly adult book full of drug use, schmecks, incredible amounts of actual child abuse, because for some reason it's just glossed over about the fact that the female love interest in this book is a minor and was driven across state lines to have intercourse with. But a 12-year-old needs to read that. I think, the conversation of censorship does not help anyone. People are going to consume this content just like they're going to watch a TV show that's too old for them. I was watching True Blood as a teenager. I shouldn't have been watching True Blood as a teenager. It gave me really high expectations of tall Viking men. But the point here is that I don't mean to infantilize you. That's not what I'm doing. What I'm saying is that you need a little bit of knowledge to know that just because you find it hot doesn't mean it's good for you. Just because you find it titillating doesn't mean it's good for you. I don't know if I can say that word on here, but we'll see. We'll see. Russian roulette it. And I'm not giving you the answer. I'm not saying don't read those books, but what I'm saying is that adults shouldn't be recommending those books. If your friend found it and recommended it to you, okay. That's a peer. If your peers are recommending you something, that's different than a 40-year-old woman telling you what you should enjoy schmexually. And though books are a safe place to discover these things, you should be having conversations. Obviously, the current state of schmex ed around North America, well, everywhere at this point, is in shambles. So if you have an adult you can comfortably talk about your schmexuality with, that you feel comfortable with, and having an actual conversation with someone who can help you navigate those things, that's great. If you don't, then I'm sorry. It's rough. I grew up Catholic. I feel like that says enough about how I grew up and my relationship as a teenager towards schmecks. But the point is adults should not be recommending this to you. It's why we have content labels like young adult. It's because it's supposed to be marketed to you. You might not like what's in the genre, and that's okay. You might want to read above your grade level. You might want to read above your comfort level, and that's totally fine, as long as an adult is not influencing you to, because it's the responsibility of an adult to make sure that you are not put in danger. And just because it's reading a book, it might not feel like it's dangerous. It might feel like censorship to say that, but if you're discovering it on your own, more power to you. That's fine. But again, adults should not be recommending this to you. It's their job to make sure you are not exposed to things that harm you. So to have adults in comment sections recommending these things, to have adults in comment sections going to young boys' TikToks to sexualize them, to be predatory to them, is unacceptable. And it is the number one issue I have with Booktok, because these are the actual dangers of those communities, is not making sure that everybody in the community is safe and taken care of. These are communities that are open to you, and there are communities that are supposed to help you stay safe. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, if someone makes you feel like you're being preyed upon, contact someone about it, because you're not supposed to feel unsafe in these actual communities. You're not supposed to feel unsafe in any community. So with that being said, that is the real issue with Booktok, in my opinion. Obviously, people can have different opinions on more or less of what they think are real issues on TikTok or Booktok or Booktube or the platform formerly known as Twitter. But at the end of the day, when it becomes a dangerous place to be, that is unacceptable and needs to be taken care of. Now, before you think this video is just about negativity, I want to highlight some very good things about Booktok and Booktube. During the schmandemic, it came out that the store Barnes & Noble, which for those who don't know is a giant big box bookseller in the United States, I don't know if they're anywhere else, but they're the United States. Our equivalent is Chapters / Kohl's in Canada. But they were ready to file for bankruptcy. Then, with the popularization of Booktok during lockdown, they didn't have to. Barnes & Noble, bookstores as a whole, saw a huge spike in sales with people reading during lockdown. It created it saved the publishing industry. People like to talk a lot of shit about it, rightfully so, but it has saved the publishing industry. Books were starting to go. It's a dying form, and I think without the consumerism, it is a dying form, realistically. Without things like Booktok, without things like Booktube, where we're actively talking and showcasing books, with the rise of indie publishing, it has saved publishing as a whole. It has saved books as a whole. It's hard to put to words how much reading and how much is being consumed because of these platforms, but it's a good thing. It's a very good thing. On that note, it's brought a lot of people like myself back into reading actively. I was a huge reader growing up. I was a huge reader through my 20s. And then, poof, I lost the ability to. But then, poof, I had nothing else to do but play The Sims and hang out with my husband and my dogs and my cats. We have a lot of animals. It allowed a lot of people to get back into reading. And on top of that, it allowed people to start reading. A lot of people saw Booktok and who might not be readers. Frankly, there are people out there who just don't like to read. My husband doesn't like to read. He loves consuming media, but he's just not a reader. He doesn't have the attention span for it, and that's okay. But there's a lot of people who decided, hell, let's give it a chance. This seems interesting. Everybody's talking about it. All I see when I'm walking into a store is a table that says Booktok recommendations, and they get into it. So a lot of people who don't partake in reading or don't have the, benefits of reading are seeing it now, and that's wonderful. And that shouldn't be understated because, let people discover things that they're interested in, but it gives the ability to showcase it more than those old celebrity read posters that you would see in classrooms or your library, where it was just a random actor like Chad Michael Murray looking distantly and off screen while he holds a book that he clearly wasn't reading. But the advertisement and desire to read has come from things like Booktok. We see things, like I said, young boys who actively look for recommendations because maybe they haven't read a book since they were, 14, and they want new stuff, and they want to find books that are to their interest and are actively seeking out recommendations through Booktok or YouTube that aren't just self-help books for men, because that seems to be a high amount of books that are just recommended to men. So you have these boys going on to Booktok and asking people for reviews, and that's great to see. Another thing we gain from Booktok is the ability to consume diverse content that we might not otherwise have seen. This goes back to following creators of color, following Black creators, following queer creators who might showcase books you probably would never have seen if you hadn't been in that community as well. So my microphone cut out for this entire section. I apologize. So you're just going to have to stare at the screen while I talk. But when we talk about diversity and what we can gain from it on Booktok and Booktube, and of course the app formerly known as Twitter, we're not just talking about diverse perspectives, we're also talking about diversifying the genres we might be into. I myself am a big horror fan when it comes to movies and television, but I'm pretty inexperienced when it comes to reading. I've had my fair share, like some of the classics, of course, but like I didn't tend to buy a lot of horror books. And last year, I started really getting into them because I had a few come on my For You page, and from there I started looking actively for content creators who were into the genre. So it helped me diversify a new genre for me. It helped me find out what I like in that genre. Authors like Stephen Graham Jones, authors like Grady Hendrix. I know Grady Hendrix is kind of like, you like him or you don't, but I like how it's never really the same with his horror books. But anyways, it helped me diversify my genres a little bit. I'm a huge epic and high fantasy consumer, and it helped me consume epic and high fantasy that might not be within like the constant English medieval style setting. It helped me diversify into things like Shogun style fantasies. It helped me be introduced to a lot of different subgenres within that genre. And because of TikTok, I was able to do so. And the last topic that I'm going to center for this is that TikTok, Booktube, Bookstagram are all sources of income for small creators. Now, I know that there is currently the debacle with the US and TikTok right now. And I know a lot of people are panicking when it comes to their income because of it. But there's no denying that it has supported people in having an income who might not otherwise be able to receive an income, There's a lot of creators who might not be able to work. They might be too young to work. They might be, unfortunately, having disabilities that keep them from working, mobility issues, otherwise. Or people like myself could just be in a horrible job market where actively looking for work is like pulling teeth. Things like TikTok and YouTube and Instagram help people pay their bills. I am just a small creator, and I have literally this week just been monetized. So I'm new to it. I've been making content now for like 2 years off and on, but I'm brand new to it, but it's still a source of income especially while I'm looking for work. So it can't be understated how helpful things like BookTube and Bookstagram and Booktok can be for small creators financially. I want to thank you if you watched this entire thing. I know it's a lot. If you want to see more of it, let me know. I enjoy just sitting down and talking about anything. I'm probably going to do some videos coming up with reviews maybe, or just what I'm reading this month. Obviously, I still do video game stuff here. I love cozy games, but I really love Baldur's Gate, and nothing is going to change that for a while. If you have any game recommendations that you're playing right now, leave them below. Book recommendations, like I said, are always welcome, no matter the genre. But yeah, I like discussing this stuff, and if you find value in it, that's great. I'm currently, sitting in my living room, just talking to a screen, giant golf ball in my hand, but I enjoyed talking about this. So if you want to see more, subscribe, like the video, share it if you want to. It really helps me as a small channel. Creators you want me to check out, let me know. Like I said, I'm going to put a list of them at the end of this video, but take care of yourself and make sure that you're doing okay, because I care about you.